All I know is that you say this was a crafts building. Okay, so it was, Thurgood sighed. I also know that an atomic explosion at 3:02 this morning blew it to hell and gone. And I've got to find out how it happened. Thurgood slumped into a field chair and gazed tiredly up at the little doctor. Where's that girl you said was in charge of this place? We've already called for Miss Abercrombie, and she's on her way here now, the doctor snapped. Outside the tent, a small army of military men and AEC technicians moved about the perimeter of the crater, scintillators in hand, examining every tiny scrap that might have been a part of the building at one time. A jeep raced down the road from the hospital and drew up in front of the tent. An armed MP helped Miss Abercrombie from the vehicle. She walked to the edge of the hill and looked down with a stunned expression. He did make an atom bomb, she cried. Colonel Thurgood, who had snapped from his chair at her words, leaped forward to catch her as she collapsed in a faint. At 4:00 p.m., the argument was still raging in the long, narrow staff room of the hospital administration building. Colonel Thurgood, looking more like a patient every minute, sat on the edge of his chair at the head of a long table and pounded with his fist on the wooden surface, making Miss Abercrombie's chart book bounce with every beat. It's ridiculous, Thurgood roared. We'll be the laughingstocks of the world if this ever gets out. An atomic bomb made out of clay. You all are nuts. You are in the right place, but count me out. At his left, Miss Abercrombie cringed deeper into her chair at the broadside. Down both sides of the long table, psychiatrists, physicists, strategists, and radiologists sat in various stages of nerve-shattered weariness. Miss Abercrombie, one of the physicists spoke up gently, you say that after the patients had departed the building, you looked again at Funston's work? The therapist nodded unhappily. And you say that, to the best of your knowledge, the physicist continued, there was nothing inside that ball but other pieces of clay? I'm positive that's all there was in it, Mrs. Abercrombie cried. There was a renewed buzz of conversation at the table, and the senior AEC man present got their heads together with the senior intelligence man. They conferred briefly, and then the intelligence officer spoke. That seems to settle it, Colonel. We've got to give this Funston another chance to repeat his bomb, but this time under our supervision. Thurgood leaped to his feet, his face purpling. Are you crazy? He screamed. You want to get us all thrown into this Filbert factory? Do you know what the newspapers would do to us if they ever got wind of the fact that for one tiny fraction of a second any one of us here entertained the notion that a paranoidal idiot with the IQ of an ape could make an atomic bomb out of kids' modeling clay? They'd crucify us. That's what they do. At 8:30 that night, Thaddeus Funston, swathed in an army officer's greatcoat that concealed his straitjacket binding him, and with an officer's cap jammed far down over his face, was hustled out of a small side door of the hospital and into a waiting staff car. A few minutes later, the car pulled into the flying field at the nearby community and drove directly to the military transport plane that stood at the end of the runway with propellers turning. 2 military policemen and a brace of staff psychiatrists sworn to secrecy under the National Atomic Secret Act bundled Thaddeus aboard the plane. They plopped him into a seat directly in front of Miss Abercrombie, and with a roar the plane raced down the runway and into the night skies. The plane landed the next morning at the AEC's atomic testing grounds in the Nevada desert, and 2 hours later, in a small, hot wooden shack miles up the barren desert wastelands, a cluster of scientists and military men huddled around a small wooden table. There was nothing on the table but a bowl of water and a great lump of modeling clay. While the psychiatrists were taking the straitjacket off Thaddeus in the staff car outside, Colonel Thurgood spoke to the weary Miss Abercrombie. Now, you're positive this is just about the same amount and same kind of clay he used before? I brought it along from the same batch we had in the storeroom at the hospital, she replied, and it's the same amount. Thurgood signaled to the doctors, and they entered the shack with Thaddeus Funston between them. The colonel nudged Miss Abercrombie. She smiled at Funston. Now, isn't this nice, Mr. Funston? She said. These nice men have brought us way out here just to see if you can make another atom bomb just like the one you made for me yesterday. A flicker of interest lightened Thaddeus's face. He looked around the shack, and then he spotted the clay on the table. Without hesitation, he walked to the table and sat down. His fingers began working the damp clay, making first the hollow, half-round shell, while the nation's top atomic scientist watched in fascination. His busy fingers flew through the clay, shaping odd flat bits and clay parts that were dropped almost aimlessly into the open hemisphere in front of him. Miss Abercrombie stood at his shoulder as Thaddeus hunched over the table, just as he had done the previous day. From time to time she glanced at her watch. The maze of clay strips grew, and as Funston finished shaping the other half-hemisphere of clay, she broke the tense silence. Time to go back now, Mr. Funston. You can work some more tomorrow. She looked at the men and nodded her head. The two psychiatrists went to Thaddeus's side as he put the upper lid of clay carefully in place. Funston stood up, and the doctors escorted him from the shack. There was a moment of hushed silence, and then pandemonium burst. The experts converged on the clay ball, instruments blossoming from nowhere and cameras clicking. For 2 hours they studied and gently probed the mass of child's clay and photographed it from every angle. Then they left it for the concrete observatory bunker several miles downrange, where Thaddeus and the psychiatrist waited inside a ring of stony-faced military policemen. I told you this whole thing was asinine, Thurgood snarled as the scientific teams trooped into the bunker. Thaddeus Funston stared out over the heads of the MPs through the open door, looking uprange over the heat-shimmering desert. He gave a sudden cry, shut his eyes, and clapped his hands over his face. A brilliance 100 times brighter than the glaring Nevada sun lit the dim interior of the bunker, and the pneumatically operated door slammed shut just before the wave of the blast hit the structure. 6 hours and a jet plane trip later, Thaddeus, once again in his straitjacket, sat between his armed escorts in a small room in the Pentagon. Through the window he could see the hurried bustle of traffic over the Potomac, and beyond, the domed roof of the Capitol. In the conference room next door, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were closeted with a gray-faced and bone-weary Colonel Thurgood and his baker's dozen of AEC brains. Scraps of the hot, scornful talk drifted across the half-open transom into the room where Thaddeus Funston sat in a neatly tied bundle. In the conference room, a red-faced four-star general cast a chilling glance at the rumpled figure of Colonel Thurgood. I've listened to some silly stories in my life, Colonel, the general said coldly, but this takes the cake. You come here with an insane asylum inmate in a straitjacket, and you have the colossal gall to sit there and tell me that this poor soul has made not one, but 2 atomic devices out of modeling clay, and then has detonated them. The general paused. Why don't you tell me, Colonel, that he can also make spaceships out of sponge rubber? The general added bitingly. In the next room, Thaddeus Funston stared out over the sweeping panorama of the Washington landscape. He stared hard. In the distance, a white cloud began billowing up from the base of the Washington Monument, and with an ear-shattering, glass-splintering roar, the great shaft rose majestically from its base and vanished into space on a tail of flame. End of A Filbert is a Nut by Rick Raphael.